Hello, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report for February 16th, 2012. I'm John Hopeful, and with me in the studio today are Cody Jones and Sky Shields from the basement, and Lyndon LaRouche. Good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. The subject we'll be treating today is largely what was been prepared by others when we had a discussion in the basement on this question. But there's one feature which is specifically my own emphasis, and that is that the great problem when you get into this area is actually twofold. First of all, we tend to believe in sense perception. And we're going into an area now where sense perception as the subject matter, as being a primary subject matter, does not work. It's only a shadow of reality. And secondly, there's another question, which is the matter of what the subject is. That is, the problem is that our reliance on sense certainty and on projections of what alleged sense certainty gets in the way of understanding. For example, the problem here is that we don't think in terms of the future. People think of the future as a projection of the past, which is why I've been so successful in economic forecasting, because virtually no economist actually treats economics competently. They always try to project from the present or the recent past to the future. It doesn't work, because the concept of the future is what is crucial here. And unfortunately, we live in a culture which depends upon sense perception, on using sense perception as a map from which you project, whereas, in fact, when we get into this area in particular, you get into the problem where you cannot do that. Just as all economic forecasting known to me by certified economic forecasters is intrinsically incompetent. It's incompetent because they're trying to project from the past, the future from the past. And that we're now in this area where we're looking at how the future is formed. We no longer believe in sense certainty. We believe in a process. We're trying to determine what the laws are that determine the future, and working through that. And we're going to find ourselves today, either in this session or in the implications of what we're going to discuss today, change your view of the whole business. Don't think in terms of sense certainty. Don't think in terms of trying to project the future from the past. That's why every one of my rivals in economics was intrinsically incompetent, because you have to define the future in terms of the future's own standpoint. And all economists that I know of depend upon projecting from the past. That's why they are incompetent. And that psychologically is the reason why this world situation is so dangerous today. Virtually every politician in the Congress is on this subject is intrinsically and viciously incompetent. They absolutely do not have any comprehension of the future. They have an idea of projecting the future from the past and present. And that does not work in this area. And we find that the more we get into these areas of this kind of physical studies, you have to go to this new area. And they're both going to be involved heavily in that. If I'm useful at some point, I'll participate again.
Right, no, for sure. No, I mean, in fact, just that theme, the principle that you use in the economic forecasting, what we'll draw out today is that this really is a principle of the physical universe. This is it's not some clever technique that you've just stuck on top, but what you've drawn out. There's a reason that the approach to economics that you take, physical economics, leads to breakthroughs in the physical sciences. And it's not.
Because the question is to define the future.
Yes.
Not to project the future from the past, but to define the future. And when we get into what we're doing with hydrogen here, in this matter-antimatter reaction, you can no longer think in the old way.
No, exactly. In fact, the ontology of time there is exactly what you're describing. Yeah. We'll discuss. I mean, this is some of the, treated correctly, what we're going to be looking at is what one of the three of the major asymmetries that you get in the physical universe that are recognized are the asymmetry of charge, of the preponderance of matter as opposed to antimatter in most of the universe. we're going to look at that and how that relates to what Vernadsky looked at very closely.
That's what we were dealing with the other day. We ran into
Exactly.
this thing on this question of the midstream between the two parts of the Van Allen belt.
Which we'll pull out. That will pull out pedagogically. And then discuss how, in fact, that does, in order to discuss that, you're going to need a very specific ontology of time.
Yep.
That's going to require, and it won't be the idea of this question of the future determining the present, as you're saying it. This is very real. And in fact, it's necessary in economic discussions because the universe requires it. You find it's not possible to discuss the questions of physics, especially in this area of antimatter physics, with a simple Laplacian notion of time.
Yeah, because what you're doing is you're talking about how is the future being determined from a standpoint of the present. And when you get into this kind of physics, when hydrogen is no longer a simple mechanical kind of base for physical science, and you start, how is the universe being generated?
Yes. Yes.
And you have to explain every phenomenon now. From this point on, once you say that hydrogen is not a self-evident particle, when you try to interpret all these phenomena that time, it breaks down.
Right. In fact, that's the most, if you take the distinction Leibniz makes between substance and accident, what's fundamental substance and what's accident, we're going to find, or whether something is simple or compound, we're going to find, in fact, that the nature of hydrogen is the most compound. And in fact, the most simple, the most primary is going to be in the domain of mind, where your economics lies.
Exactly.
So I mean, we can guess, maybe we can hop right in to the specifics of the pedagogy, and we can lay out, I would say that, just to make clear, that's where we're going to go with this. We'll go through some very specific pedagogical points on this question of antimatter, specifically as they came up in the recent work in the basement and upgrading our whole perspective for Mars colonization. As in discussing, really mapping out, well, what is this intervening space that we're going to be moving through? That you're not moving through empty space when you're talking about colonizing the interplanetary space. You're actually taking an existing structure that's there, a very real, very substantial, very active, energetic structure, and then reorganizing it according to principles of mind and human society to permit the propagation of cognition into areas of willful cognition into areas where it hasn't yet reached willfully. And so we've mapped out a lot of this and we're going to take some time and linger on this region of near-Earth phenomena. Near-Earth phenomena, it actually goes far out compared to where we've been now. We're talking about several Earth radii, but this is going to be, frankly, small scale compared to the colonization we're discussing. But we'll see how much is packed into just this little region here.
Right. And in fact, it's even to make a distinction between Earth, near Earth, etc. Once you start to now investigate what is the actual physical space-time curvature of the environment that we're operating in, the lines between Earth and space and beyond Earth actually become very blurred. Because what you find is that it's one continuous, structured, developing phenomena. That it's not distinct objects floating in empty space, which is one of the main fallacies which is promoted even to this day. I mean, anyone who's been in just your basic physics class or basic astronomy class, the image that's given to you is you're literally told, think of the Earth as this kind of very colorful, swirly marble, which is just somehow floating out there in empty space. And then you've got these other very colorful marbles like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, all just somehow floating there, and that's really our idea of the solar system. Mostly empty space, but with these little objects in between. The same image, then they try to project that into the subatomic. That's how you're then supposed to also think of an atom, say hydrogen. Oh, it's just this nucleus, mostly empty space, and then these whirling electrons around it. Now, that's a very simplistic idea that a foolish person might come up with if they tried to construct a world image simply based on simple sense certainty, based on a simple vision-based idea of the nature of physical space-time. But what we've come across in the recent period, as we are kind of conspiring to determine what the future of the human species would be, in mapping out the immediate perspective of a Mars colonization, which we based off of a number of phases leading up to that, starting with the development of so-called near-Earth space, onto the development and industrialization of the moon, which would then be the basis for construction and development of materials and ships that would then be the launch point as we extend out to Mars. But just looking at our immediate environment, you come across some very, very interesting phenomena, which gives you an idea of a structuring which comes about as a result of really the intersection of, most immediately, cosmic phenomena and biological processes. That you can never, even whenever you're discussing so-called astrophysics, you can never leave out the phenomena of the principle of life. And what we'll come to is you can most definitely not leave out the principle of intention and creative development, characteristic of the human mind. So the first thing that popped up as we were looking at this was what's known as the Van Allen belts. And what you'll see is just a image, a diagram of how this is depicted. Now, obviously, maybe not so obvious to most people, the image that you'll see, though it is a vision-based image, is not anything you would ever see simply with vision. It's a model which was generated, projected into the visual domain, but was generated based off of knowledge discovered through what we would call our extended sensorium, satellites, and other types of things that can reach out and read the effects of the extended domain of the electromagnetic spectrum. So here what you've got is what's known as the Van Allen belts, which are effectively thought of as two donut-shaped rings which encircle the Earth. The inner one often discussed as being largely composed of positive electrons or positive protons, etc., and then the outer one, which is largely negative-based. Now, a number of interesting things come up. First off, this is something which is wholly created through the interaction of, one, the Earth's geomagnetic field. Right away, that brings up some very interesting questions, such as why does Earth even have a magnetic field? The popular assumptions about it really don't hold water, because you have, for example, why is it that every other planet in our solar system has a magnetic field where the intervening ones don't? There's obviously some broader order to the magnetic characteristics of our solar system beyond just the simple idea of a internal generator, which is usually how it's discussed. You've got some sort of internal generator of the Earth which is producing the magnetic field. Right away, a question is raised when you look at some recent phenomena that are emerging, or some recent evidence that's emerging, which is that, one, the point at which they can date the first, what they think is the first coming into existence of the magnetic field, coincides with the dating of the first records, fossil records, of life on Earth. So that you have this coincidence of what seems to be the emergence of the geomagnetic field and the emergence of life on Earth, at least in a discrete form. What causes what? Is there a unifying generator which produces both of them? Those are still open questions. But what we know is that there's a definite coincidence between the two, between the geomagnetic field and the emergence of life. Now, once you have a geomagnetic field, you now have the ability to start to capture much of the radiation which is coming in from the sun and from other galactic and extragalactic sources, cosmic radiation. So these structures that we see, which we've called the Van Allen belts because they were hypothesized and then discovered by a man, Van Allen, are an effect of the relationship of, one, the geomagnetic field and the interaction between the radiant activity of the sun and galactic cosmic radiation.
We should say, I think people might be, but just for the people who aren't familiar, just to make clear that these are super dense regions of radiation that we're discussing.
Right.
These are regions of kind of strange, structured. They're, as you described, these sort of trapped charged particles, which keep a fairly permanent position around the Earth.
Except for, and this is another interesting thing that came up that gives you an idea that, first off, these are not just simple objects. Because the other idea is then to think, well, you've got this object Earth, and maybe you've now got these other objects around it, which are otherwise existing in an empty space. But indicative of the fact that it's not objects in space, but really what you're seeing is a manifestation of an overall curvature of the physical space-time. That's really what's ontologically primary, is the curvature of the physical space-time, is indicated by an event that occurred in May. For 2 days in May of 1999, the sun effectively shut down in terms of its sending off of the solar wind. So for 2 days in May, the sun was no longer pumping out the solar wind. In the process, the Van Allen belts themselves disappeared, which was a very anomalous phenomenon, that this thing disappeared because of some change in the sun. But then as soon as the sun effectively kicked back into action, all of a sudden these things reemerge, which gives you an idea that really it's the structure is what precedes the actual effect, so to speak. The structure is already there. Now, something interesting has also come to light as we've looked more into this. And this becomes very important as you start to think about sending human beings out into reaches beyond the surface of the Earth. You know, how are these Van Allen belts, how do they affect the biology of living organisms, of human beings? How do we deal with it? How can we potentially harness it for positive effects? Now, something that's come up, and this is interesting, here's another sort of cross-sectional image of the Van Allen belts and relative to the Earth. Now, what you'll see is you've got two different axes running through the Earth there. One is the rotational axis, and the other one is the axis of the magnetic field. Now, you'll see that they have a certain tilt relative to each other. Now, because of that tilt, it's created a condition where the southern hemisphere of the Earth is actually tilted more into the inner region of the inner Van Allen belt. So that you have, in many cases, it's as close as several hundred kilometers from the surface of the Earth to the inner region of the inner Van Allen belt. What they've discovered as they sent a number of satellites through this region is that, in fact, this area is an area of at least 3 orders of magnitude concentration density greater than what you would normally find of antimatter. That you've got this very anomalous region where you've got this density of concentration of antimatter. And it's what's known as, and you can see it's down in the bottom right corner there. I'll show another image here. What you're seeing here is an image of that concentration of antimatter, some 3 orders of magnitude greater density of antimatter in this region than what you find in the inner parts of the Van Allen belt, and up to 4 orders of magnitude more dense than what you would find just in the outer regions. Now, what this is known as is the South Atlantic anomaly. And there's all kinds of interesting things here. One, anytime planes or satellites fly through this area, there's always a danger that you're going to have certain kind of mechanical failures and electric shortings. In fact, whenever astronauts flew through this area, this is where they reported seeing stars in their eyes, so to speak. Or even whenever their eyes were closed, they would report these intense flashes that they would experience in their visual field. And now it's largely thought that it's because they are passing through this region of dense concentration of antimatter. So here you've got, now here's the interesting thing, is that this, again, what you're seeing depicted by this South Atlantic anomaly is, again, not just some sort of object that just happened to pop into existence. But again, I think you can think of it more as a kind of singularity, which results from the effect of the interaction of cosmic processes with biological processes. Because part of what's actually generating this density is the interaction of the Van Allen belt, the inner Van Allen belt, with the life-generated atmosphere. That, for all intents and purposes, were the Earth a planet devoid of life without the atmosphere that life generates, you wouldn't necessarily have this kind of concentration. So what you're seeing, again, is something which is an effect of the intersection of these various types of fields of curved space-time. In this case, the domain of the living, sort of the effects of the activity of life, intersecting and sort of coordinating with the effects of cosmic phenomena, galactic phenomena. Now, just as a side note, it's been pointed out that this region may be a place that we could utilize for capture of antimatter to then be used for some of these antimatter rockets. We've discussed this before, but the most efficient fuel source that man could use, at least at this time, for really the farthest reaches of travel, to go out towards the edge of our solar system, out towards some of the nearest stars, would be to utilize antimatter reactions, largely because it's such a dense source where the matter equivalent of it is wholly converted into energy, gamma ray energy, so that the amount of thrust and energy output that you can get per weight of material is such that you can overcome a number of the bounds that you would ordinarily run into, where, as you're talking about space travel, thrust to weight ratios become very important. And so antimatter is really the source we want to start to harness and use for some of the furthest reaches of space travel. So again, here's a region which has been proposed. Maybe we can start to mine this area to utilize this antimatter. And the beautiful thing is that it's actually a replenishable source. Because again, it's not just a static object there. It's an area of intersection. It's an area of creative activity, such that we can mine this stuff all we want, but because of the singular nature of this area, it's constantly going to be replenished. There's also been discovered in the rings of Saturn a concentration of antimatter, also in the area of Jupiter. So there's even discussion about using sort of these staged refueling points, where we'd have ships that would basically refuel at these different points in the solar system to collect the antimatter there to then continue our flight outwards. Something else interesting comes up here, which gets at a similar kind of point of we're constantly looking at, in thinking about the structure of what we now have to think about as the extended biosphere. I think it's false to think of the biosphere as simply just this very thin envelope around Earth, but really the biosphere encompasses at least out through the Van Allen belts, and really ultimately is connected to the sun, the whole solar system, and really we start to think about life as a universal phenomena. Really the biosphere, in a sense, is a universal principle. It's just we've sort of limited the way we define the effects of life. But I think as we look deeper into really what is the principle of life, we're going to find that it really is something which permeates and expresses itself throughout the universe, though perhaps in forms which are completely unfamiliar to us at this point. Now, another effect that comes up that really is the relationship, which shows the dynamic relationship between the principle of life and these galactic phenomena, is something we'll depict here, which just initially, up until most recently, as you saw in this previous picture, you've got this inner Van Allen belt, you've got the outer Van Allen belt. Now, there's what's called the safe zone in between the two, which is a zone which is often utilized by satellites because you don't have the concentration of charged particles there which can disrupt their functioning. So it's thought, well, maybe this is just a safe zone, maybe it's empty. But what we found is that, in fact, between the two Van Allen belts, that space is maintained by radio waves. And radio waves which themselves are generated by lightning here on Earth. So that you've got lightning effects here on Earth, which are generating radio waves, which are then sending them up through this so-called safe zone and sort of clearing out the area and maintaining the zone of radio frequency waves. I'll show, here's a animation of that put together by NASA. So you see the lightning storms here on the surface of the Earth, which are then creating and a lot of people might not realize this, but lightning generates effects along the whole spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're just familiar with the visual effects for the most part. But here you see these radio waves sent up along the magnetic field lines through this inner region of the Van Allen belts, creating this so-called safe zone. But it's a safe zone which is created and maintained by radio waves, which are themselves generated by lightning. Now, the interesting thing about this, as we've discussed, lightning itself is wholly a function and an effect of living activity. That if you look at a map of where the concentration of thunderstorms occurs, it's largely in regions over land masses, and particularly regions which are very dense with life, jungle areas, rainforest areas. That wasn't always the case. As hopefully most people are aware, life didn't always have a massive colonization of the continents. It mostly emerged out of the oceans, and eventually, some 400-some million years ago, took over the surface, colonized it, and then created this abundance of life on the continents. That then created the cycling, the weather and water cycles, which then fueled and really generated the potential for these lightning storms. These lightning storms, which are the effect of living activity, are then the thing that both fuel these radio frequencies, which are then clearing out this region in the Van Allen belts, and also are responsible for creating such effects here in the lower atmosphere of what are known as the Schumann resonances, which are these extremely low frequency resonances that resonate between the surface of the Earth and the lower layer of the ionosphere. And there's a lot that goes into that. One of the more interesting things is that the frequencies which the Schumann resonances resonate at are frequencies which are coherent with the sort of the standing wave frequency of the mammalian brain. If you do these EEG readings of the brain, sort of standing wave brainwave activity of mammalian brains and also human brains, those frequencies are in coherence with the Schumann resonances. So the Schumann resonance, in a sense, provides a kind of background upon which brain activity is operating and resonating with. Also, there's sort of just some initial investigation. Those frequencies are also in a certain coherence with the flickering frequency, so to speak, of the Crab Nebula. So there may be a certain broader coherence between the activity of the Crab Nebula, the Schumann resonances here on Earth, and then just the activity of particularly the mammalian brain, which is the most evolved form of life on the planet. So you've got this process where life, the principle of life, interacting with the various principles and phenomena on a cosmic scale, are creating all of this very structured dynamic. And it's a dynamic which is constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly developing. And what we're seeing here is just simply sort of the effect of the interaction of these various domains of basically fields of physical space-time, the living field, the noetic field, and the cosmic field. And this is really the kind of perspective that we have to have if we're truly going to take on the extraterrestrial imperative. If we're going to get beyond just the trappings of the chains of the oligarchical system, which have trapped us here on this planet, which hate science. I mean, people do need to realize that the same fallacies that we see coming up in free trade economics, the same fallacies that we see coming up in strategic thinking, like what we're seeing with Obama and the war danger, that the ontological roots of those fallacies are the same ones that drive the fallacies that we find in science. The second law of thermodynamics has the same root as the principle of free trade economics, right? It's all rooted in this idea of the oligarchical principle. Keep man stupid, keep man controlled, don't allow creativity to thrive, because creativity is the threat to the oligarchy. Creativity to them is the ultimate, is their ultimate enemy. And so if we ourselves are going to take on this extraterrestrial imperative, we have to, one, both throw off the chains of the oligarchical system as it expresses itself in politics and economics, but also as it expresses itself in science. Throw off the chains of an adherence to a simple sense-based idea of our relationship to reality, and move towards one which is based more on being able to peer into the actual principles which organize the phenomena that we see expressed in such things as these as these Van Allen belts. And so this is just the immediate challenge, just so-called near Earth. You know, who's to say then what then other challenges we're going to face as we even move beyond this and start talking about industrializing the moon and Mars? Those are still open questions which we have not nearly done enough investigation on.
I mean, on the, I can just back up to the point. I mean, this is something we've covered in some earlier discussions about, well, what do you actually mean when you're using this whole discussion of interplanetary space to define life and cognition in a distinct way? Because this is the point Vernadsky made, that when you're talking about life, you're not just talking about a living organism. In fact, the living organism, you identify it, you recognize this as an effect. That yes, well, in most cases, you're not confused between, say, glass and rabbit. You can distinguish between something that seems to be non-living and something living. There's a very small number of cases where there might be some ambiguity there, but in most cases not. So you can empirically determine this with fair certainty. But being able to say now principally what exactly is the distinction there, that's where people end up getting themselves completely screwed up trying to figure this thing out. You've got, I think, NASA has some very strange official definition of life, which they basically have to keep pasting properties onto it. Well, does it self-replicate, and does it do this? And then by the time you're done making this list, you always end up finding something that fits that isn't alive, and then they spend the next 5 years in this complicated debate. Well, should we say this sheet of paper is alive now that it managed to self-replicate? And the real problem is their definition. When you say, okay, I can tell that this isn't. You don't get trapped in your own logical definition and then try to sort of wrestle your way out of that. You have to say, well, is there a way to pull back instead and identify a principle? Now, Vernadsky says you don't know. The living thing is simply a singularity in something much larger. He says, well, I'll look at that much larger. So he coins this idea of the biosphere and says, well, I'm going to investigate this. But now what a lot of people aren't familiar with is that in his work, he himself begins to go to this much broader picture, where he says, well, I need to identify the role of cosmic radiation, of all these extraterrestrial phenomena and their effect within the biosphere to begin to identify this thing. And as you're showing here, you look at this scale of the development, it's useful to put together that when you look at these charts of evolutionary development, you're looking at these charts supposedly, typically you draw on it the little animals that are on there. But if you really pulled way back and we saw this whole picture along that course of time, what you'd really be looking at is the evolutionary development of the entirety of interplanetary space.
Right. But you're attacking an assumption in that way. The assumption is that you have these individual entities which each have internal characteristics. And what we've just been presenting here is exactly that's not true. What we call the individuality is not what we think it is.
Right.
The individuality is a product and with a reciprocal relationship between it and the process in which it participates. And therefore, all our visual image, we have to realize that our sense perceptions are deceptive. And when we take the sense perceptions phenomena and start to do it, as we've been doing here so far, you immediately come into an area that there is no such thing as a clear identity, a separate, independent identity.
Right.
The universe is interconnected in every respect. And the point is, we just don't know that because we're so pleased to interpret things from the standpoint of sense perception.
Right.
And when we get into this thing, you immediately leave the department of sense perception. It's sort of a Riemannian statement.
Yeah.
The rule of science is leave the department of sense certainty immediately.
Right.
And if you don't, you're going to be trapped in some kind of a thing. Yeah. There is a significance to individuality, but it's not individuality in the ontological sense that people say something which is totally independent, willfully independent.
It's not an aggregate of objects stuck together.
When we do something and we act in the universe, we are actually affecting the universe. We're not affecting an object. We're affecting the universe in which we're operating. And so when we get into this, and the Van Allen belt raises exactly this kind of question, especially the matter-antimatter feature in between the two Allen belts, which you take care of. So this thing poses a way of thinking about our universe which is completely different than all sense certainty explanations.
Yeah.
And what gets in our way is the fact that we are not yet prepared to react properly to the universe, even the solar system around us, even the inner part of the solar system around us. We're not prepared to react to that competently.
No, there's a new worldview that needs to be revived. I mean, it's interesting how much this reaffirms, with experimental fact, the view that Leibniz had. His view, well, how do you get causality? What is the interaction? They're not the interaction between these objects. He says interaction between what he refers to as these monads is always mediated through nothing less than the universe as an entirety.
Which comes from Nicholas Cusa.
Yes, exactly.
And so the
Exactly.
Cusa viewpoint on science, which is the foundation of all modern physical science, is Cusa's work. And this says that you're part of a system. You're not an independent part of a system.
Right.
And it's this idea of independence. You know, in responsibility, yes, we are responsible. We cause something to happen. We are causing the system to change.
Right.
And we're accountable for those changes that our activities introduce into the system, and vice versa. We are also the victims of the process which we act upon.
Right.
And it's the understanding of the individual identity in these terms of reference, which is not yet solved as a physical problem, but which I think that what we're doing today or approaching today in terms of the enigmas of the Van Allen belt, these enigmas about what's in between, the matter-antimatter function. Because this is the key issue. But it's in those terms of reference and only that we begin to approximate an understanding of what the devil we're dealing with.
Yes, and like you said, it makes the point. It really gives you an idea. I mean, it scraps the standard reductionist view of both physics and chemistry, and certainly the idea that you can reduce anything else to those.
What's the physics of life?
Yeah.
How can you reduce life as a principle to a physics problem in the ordinary? You can't.
Right. And again, that reaffirms Cusa. I mean, people take, you know, if you look at Cusa's Unlearned Ignorance or definitely On Conjectures, where he sort of, you can take it as, oh, this is a creation story. He's giving you, how do you get, starting with, and it initially seems like a very peculiar way. How do you start with, he starts with the creator as he defines it, but as a principle defined in the terms that the Pythagoreans use, and then gives you the unfolding of the physical universe.
The problem is that one we mentioned at the beginning here. We've got it backwards.
Exactly.
It is the future that is determining the present.
Yeah, and that's what he gives you as this creation. So what you realize, the creation story is really, it's not how would I say, not just theology in that sense. It really is giving you an ontology. Now you say, well, exactly how do you get the ordering of properties in the physical universe? It's actually there in what he gives you as the unfolding there.
That's where this problem comes up in exactly the way when you think of terms that causality is located in reverse to what we call time.
And that's where a lot of the problems come up whenever people try to say, well, what happened whenever a creative discovery occurred? They're always trying to look at, well, what was the thought process that built up to the discovery? And once they get to the point of discovery, they just have to throw up their hands and say, oh, well, it was insight, it was mystical, it was magical.
Yeah, but very simply.
Right, because it was actually coming from a different direction.
Because mankind cause and effect from its intention.
Right.
So the physical effect was the result of an intention which occurred before the phenomenon was registered as a phenomenon.
Yeah, right.
And that's the key point in this whole business. And that's what once we get into this matter-antimatter reaction, our conception of physical space is completely transformed. And it's those who are rejecting that, resisting that miss the point. That's why every economist I know who does forecasting does it incompetently. Sometimes they do something which does work competently in like analysis. But never do they have a conception of causality, because the causality always lies in the effect on the future.
Right.
It lies in what we call intention. And we think and because people don't understand intention as a future process, they think it's the past acting on the future.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
It's the future acting on the past.
And this is the problem. I mean, people believe that the universe is ontologically deductive, and trying to stick to that assumption just leads to so many unauthentic paradoxes. They're not real paradoxes.
Look, the danger on the planet today, the greatest source of danger, and there's also a threat of human extinction. As long as we keep Obama in office, we are faced with the probability even of human extinction in the very near future. It could even happen this year. It's because we don't realize that intention actually determines the future. And there are all kinds of intention in the universe which do that, but also mankind. If mankind decides to go to a war against Russia and China, which is what the British intention is for the United States, it can happen almost any time now. It can be stopped, but it can happen almost any time. It's the intention which determines the present.
Right.
And that is not understood. But that's the thing. Once you get beyond the assumption that hydrogen is a self-existing object, and don't realize it's a product of a process. If you don't realize what intention is, and well, this is what I write about. But if you don't understand this, there's an intrinsic error. But the point, because people do not realize, these stupid people who are still defending Obama don't realize that their very decision, intention to maintain Obama in office is what can destroy humanity and certainly destroy the United States.
Because the thing, I mean, you can tell they just don't recognize what the actual object is that they're acting on. If you can't see the intention, you can't see the enemy.
And that's because this whole belief in the fact that the future is determined by the present. When it's a decision on the present which determines what the future will be generated.
Which allows that you get this sort of, you do get this, as you described, you called it sort of a reciprocal action of the future and the present on one another in order to drive, because you have to find where is the space for intention to exist. It's not there in any mathematical representation of time.
There never has been a successful statistical forecast of the future economy. There never has been. And there never will be.
The definition of creativity, if you want real creativity, is something that's not capable of being deduced from the present. Which means that you're not capable of projecting anything statistical from the present.
And what we're getting into now in this subject matter, we're getting on the physics subject matter here, just within this barrier of what's the implications of the Van Allen valve. You're already getting into precisely that condition. You cannot explain a damn thing, particularly when we're going to get into now. This area, you cannot explain anything about it. Unless you change your viewpoint. If you think like a statistician, you're an idiot.
And that's part of the problem with the oligarchical system, which people, they don't want to acknowledge, is that the instinct of the oligarchy is to act against the future.
That's because of the brainwashing. The oligarchical system, which is the oldest system of organized society, which we can actually know in some detail, is based on this conception. And the brainwashing of people into believing in the oligarchical principle, which is what this stuff is what the chief cause of humanity's problems.
You see the manifestation just even in the recent, this FY13 budget that's come out. Look at some of the key things that are cut out of it. The 2 joint missions that the U.S. had signed on to work with the European Space Agency to just send 2 more probes to Mars. Those are 2 things that have been cut out of the current budget. On top of that, the other thing that we just saw yesterday that was cut out was funding for things like fusion development. They're taking away funding from the magnetic confinement fusion development. So now some people might want to look at it and say, well, these are just accidental effects of the system. But what people don't understand is that that's actually the intention of the system. That the intention of the oligarchical system has always been, their #1 enemy has always been science. So they create a system, a monetarist system, a political structure, whose intended effect is to destroy science, to attack the future. And so these things we're seeing, which people try to write off as maybe accidents of the process, are actually the intended effects of the process.
And as a result, people can't respond to an attack launched by the enemy. Now that was consciously trained. I mean, if you think, we've mentioned before, you think about the psychological assault that was launched against the U.S. population after the assassination of Kennedy. You know, after Kennedy was murdered, but then it was followed up by everything you had with the Warren Commission. I mean, you think now to where people have they basically have an anti-conspiracy theory in their head, where the oligarchy has successfully managed to convince people that they don't exist in an amazing way. Because if you destroy people, this is better than anything you could ever get in anything proposed by Aldous Huxley, anything proposed in these earlier texts. You've managed to erase in people's minds the ability to even consider that the enemy exists. Because anything, you say, okay, well, anything that has the form of an intention must not be real. Only things that have the form of an effect can be real. So you end up with the equivalent of, you keep waking up and finding bullet holes next to your head, and you assume that your roommate must be accidentally, this belief in lone gunmen.
Because I don't believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I don't believe that somebody could have the intent.
Right now, with the behavior of the U.S. Congress, or the majority of the U.S. Congress, they're not fit to live in terms of their intentions. They're stupid people. I mean, on the issue of the survival of civilization, or the survival of the United States, most of the members of Congress are systemically insane because of this kind of belief. They talk about, well, there's this and there's that, and this option and that option and option. They don't realize there's a juggernaut coming down on you of inevitability. You get out of the way, or you change, or you die. And our humanity in this nation is in the danger of extinction. What they're going to throw thermonuclear weapons, which the United States has and the British are using by being loaned by the United States for the British. They intend to do this on China and Russia and other countries. That is an extermination blast. In other words, the object of this kind of warfare with thermonuclear weapons is extinction of the target, because so the target can't shoot back, especially targets that have thermonuclear capabilities in terms of weaponry, as Russia and China do have thermonuclear capabilities. Now, the intention of the British and Obama is a thermonuclear attack on the Soviet Union, or Russia rather, and China, among other nations. So that means that the Russians are now being pushed, and China's are being now pushed to set a counter threat. Because the other thing, passive reaction, is extinction. They have no choice but to shoot back. So they will shoot back. Now, when you think of the effect of this, how many people are going to be living on this planet under conditions of a post-thermonuclear counterchange? You take the number, just take the number of the warheads which the U.S. Navy has, which would usually be deployed mainly from the Pacific against Russia and against China, and what the effect of that is with a countermeasure. Because the minute those things start flying from the United States and Britain and so forth against the United States, the Russian and Chinese things are going to start flying too at that point. And after the two sets of blasts, because it will be the United States and so forth that may set the thing off first. After those two blasts, how much is left on the planet out of the rubbish heap that's left by this kind of exchange? Just count the number of these weapons, these warheads. Count them. Measure the effect of just these weapons. And here you have a population of the United States, like the members of Congress we've been talking to recently. It's pitiful. These guys are pitifully incompetent, and also contemptibly, because they, just on a moral ground, they ought to be opposed to this crap. But they're so afraid of Obama, they haven't got the guts to move against him. He should be put in a booby hatch where he belongs. A safe booby hatch. We want to kill him. We want to be protected, I guess, especially from himself. But anyway, this is the situation. And why? Because the evidence is there, which any sane person should recognize. But they choose to say the assurance, but the authorities I'm afraid of, the people who I'm afraid of offending, will not allow me to do this. Therefore, I'm not going to do anything to upset them against me. I'll wait and see how it works out. And you can imagine the result that they're looking for. So therefore, the idea of a human extinction, or something approaching a human extinction effect, is something which is very real and very immediately plausible. My estimate is that as long as this president, Obama, remains as president, instead of being removed under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, as he should be, the humanity itself is not safe. And people who oppose us on this kind of thing are functionally, clinically insane, morally insane, because they're not respecting the reality. If our commitment is to protect humanity and to go on to missions for humanity which make sense for mankind, then these guys are doing the wrong thing. And I know why the British do it. Very few people understand the British Empire. They don't understand how it works, which is another problem. They don't wish to know how it works.
This is why they can make these silly arguments, oh, they won't do that. Oh, that's so bad. Nobody would let that happen. They don't get that this is the character of the process.
We took a poll of the somebodies in the Congress, and we found that nobody was present. No, this is the situation. It's because they are not compelled to face the implications of the foolishness they're about to participate in. They just simply deny that that danger exists. Yeah. They say, I don't accept that. I refuse to believe that. And that's all they do. And that's the way suicide, mass suicide, is perpetrated. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so
I mean, it's the way civilizations get lost. But like you're saying, with the level of technology we're right now with thermonuclear weaponry, you're not just talking about the loss of a civilization.
What I was concerned about when I did this draft last night, or early this morning actually, I just got up and said I'm going to do it, rather than just leave the thing open. It's just exactly that. If there's a sufficient understanding, a correction of some degree of understanding of how this solar system and the universe work, as we are capable of knowing that now, is why this discussion is so important. If you just take those facts into consideration, they say, stop it. You're nuts. Cut it out. There's no reason for anyone to go to thermonuclear war. That is actually a suicide, mass suicide. Whether you think it's going to be mass suicide or not, it is going to be mass suicide. China and Russia are thermonuclear powers. And the United States represents the greatest concentration of thermonuclear weaponry, especially even in the Navy, in the submarine fleet, on this planet. That with a counter reaction against the targeted nations would bring the whole question of an extermination of mankind into question, or something approximating that, either as an initial action or as a chain reaction effect of the action.
The irony shouldn't be lost that we're moving towards that suicide point in lockstep with Al-Qaeda suicide bombers. You know, here we are basically taking up the same mission in Syria that Al-Qaeda is calling for.
Maybe the same author, like a British author.
Yeah, exactly.
The British who organized the Al-Qaeda attack on the buildings in New York City.
Yep.
And now this president is backing up the Al-Qaeda team. The same people who did the attack on the Twin Towers, under BAE funding and supplies and British direction.
Right.
How insane can mankind be? But these facts are the facts we have to get into, because we have to get into not only how bad that is, but we have to begin to understand what the real laws of the universe are that we must take into account, so we don't make these kinds of stupid mistakes.
Right. So it's one and the same investigation. Because we've made the point before that what we're looking at in terms of going out into space, colonizing Mars, it's not just one of many options of things we might like to do. It's actually a necessity. It's an extraterrestrial imperative. It's a necessary act on the part of man if we're going to evolve and avoid extinction.
If you wanted to argue theologically, the question of whether mankind is fit to exist is what's being posed.
Yeah.
And I think those who are not impressed by that, shall we say, are going to hell en masse.
Yeah.
We've got a chance right now, because what you're really discussing is, can you get humanity to raise to its inheritance? You've got an individual that reflects this entire set of individuals, in the same way as we discussed that the singular elements in the biosphere, these animals, are not distinct objects. They reflect a much larger process of life. The individual human is not a separate object. The individual willfully creative human is reflecting a process that's actually much, much larger. In theological terms, yours get man made in the image of the Creator. But that's a very rigorously provable scientific concept, that you've got that creativity that you see manifested in the small is potentially a reflection in the large, if we're willing to act on those terms.
Well, the point is, which of course I think is probably a little bit too much for here, even though I made notations on this occasion, is the fact that there is a question of mind. See, most people don't think in terms of the future. They don't think of the future. They think as the future as something that might happen to them. They don't think of the future as something determining their fate. And all we can do is act on the future. And there are ways we can act on the future. So that's where the problem lies. And when mankind has got to learn what mankind is, but this takes us to see that. We have to say, well, mankind is actually a part of the decision-making that affects our future.
And it's been beat out of people. I mean, that's been the policy of the last several decades, to psychologically, emotionally beat that out of a population. We have to bring it back.
Yeah, but see, I think in terms of the future. I always think from the future, especially in economics. And the future is not something that might happen. The idea that you have to use statistics to project the future itself is a form of insanity. Because what happens is when you act on the future, and you are acting on the future, the cause is not something being pushed from behind you, it's something which is pulling you, shall we say, so to speak. And in that area, mankind does have the capability. And the reason for incompetence in economics, in almost everyone in this area, is they're always looking at the push me viewpoint. Yeah. And it doesn't work that way. The question is, how do you orchestrate, like the process we're talking already, how does this process predetermine a potential which lies in the future? Most people don't think in terms of a living future. They think of the future as some witch doctor predicting something. And that's the point. And getting into this area of realizing that the hydrogen atom is not the bottom line of chemistry, and realizing that it's an effect, and that therefore what we're looking at when we look at this kind of process, this kind of physics, this Aristotelian physics, you're actually looking at the kind of thing you should be looking at. But which is the question is, what is the relationship between life as a principle and physics?
Right.
And that's the point. And that's the matter. We are going to have to do a lot more detailing to make it clear to people what this means. Right. And you only get to that point when you realize that the idea that the hydrogen atom is the basis, which most people who've got some kind of chemistry course come out with, and realize that there is no such thing as this hydrogen atom as such. But you begin to look at it from the standpoint of what lies between the two Van Allen belts and those implications. You begin, oh my God. And that's what we've got to get across to people.
And that you get, I mean, we've addressed it in an earlier video, a video we put out on the website called The Matter of Mind, but to recognize the ontological problems trying to build the universe up from hydrogen atoms, or from anything building upward, is the same problem you get in Euclid's elements. The idea that you can construct lines from points and planes from lines and solids from planes. You can't build the universe that way because you can't define what the point is. Yeah. But if you can come the other direction, you say, well, instead I'll begin with a gestalt. I begin with concepts. I begin with something that exists in the domain of mind, and I can work downward, and I can derive matter from that. Then you're in the real universe.
Well, the only way to explain it to people is to say, well, you're looking down the road there, and something is coming at you. Now, if you could have foresight, not by sense perception, but foresight that something is coming toward you, couldn't you understand how you have to act, what you have to act on to change the decision? So the decision-making is foresight. And this, of course, is the ancient classical Greek view of foresight. Right? So the point is simply that if we don't rely upon simplistic sense-perceptional terms, things, but if we look at what we call foresight and consider examples of how foresight has worked, this is a sense of science, the science of foresight, which is what I use in economics. And it's the reason I've been successful in this thing, and others have failed, because they're always thinking in terms of chain reaction from the present to the future, and they come up in terms of probability, and they're always wrong. They're terribly wrong right now. Yeah. Whereas the point is, we have to define the shaping of what we call the future, and we do have the ability to shape the formation of the future.
And that is, again, that's the very real, rigorous definition of what we mean by immortality.
Exactly.
That the human individual doesn't exist at a point in time, but you should act and exist, in a sense, across time.
But we're accustomed to terms of thinking and terms of argument which do not make any sense in reality. When you realize that there is, in fact, a determination of the consequences of present decisions, and that therefore you should be looking at the things which give you the predetermination of where you're headed, your destination. And you should think from the destination that you're going to back to your present action. From that standpoint, you can see that everything that happens, you have some indication of beforehand.
Yeah.
It's just how good your science is. Right. As you make your science better, you have better insight into the future. Now all these things have to be, whereas the idiot, like the members of Congress, and they are behaving like idiots right now, cowardly idiots, but the cowardly lion was a cowardly lion. Right? So these cowardly lions, or cowardly idiots, as you may prefer to call them, simply refuse to face the reality because they're going to depend upon what their peers are going to think about them, what Wall Street is going to think about them. They don't think of reality. They think of what Wall Street or something else is going to think about them. And they hope they get a cookie as a result of that kind of obediently conforming.
I mean, you can see how trapped they are, because a number of the people we talk to realize that even moving in this direction is going to lead to their own death and destruction. They're aware of it, but they can't conceive of anything else outside of that.
We're going to have to go out. I think we're going to have to do is, I think we intended to do, but it's running up. I think what this hydrogen question, by starting from what we were doing on this already, in terms of the Van Allen belts, right, and go to that where that leads to, and then look at from that standpoint how we should be regarding this thing.
Yeah, we can pursue.
No.
Start to map our future.
Exactly, because we do have the ability to understand our future, and we have, when you no longer take hydrogen, the hydrogen atom, as being a self-evident object in any sense. Right. You immediately are confronted with that kind of problem in physics. And that for that reason, the recent developments of the discovery on the Van Allen belt effect in the inner feature of that. Right. This to me, it was, I just been saying we need this. We need this.
Right. It does, as we got back to it, exactly this is the Leibnizian conception. You're always looking at how does any one phenomena, one entity, reflect the process of the universal development as a whole.
And then how do you reduce what that hand is that you're looking at?
Right. Right.
You're looking at the hand of the future moving.
Right.
And you just collect more and more information which goes to the hand that is moving. Right. But has not yet reached you, has not yet touched you.
Right. And every time we act on it, we actually change it.
And now to think of this little thing inside the Earth's system, of the Van Allen belt, and this little inner thing of matter-antimatter core to the whole process, which relates the two processes. Right. This opens up the whole thing in a very specific way, which I think is the most precious approach to be taken right now.
Right. Yeah, I like it. It seems like that defines the task for the immediate future.
Well, I think what I think is essentially that we do have the ability, mankind does have the intrinsic ability to act on the future if we understand how the future is presented to us. Right. For example, take the case of, well, this is another question, but take these kinds of things that we do know, and we find that we have the means to actually do the equivalent of forecasting. And we can define what decisions are that we should make based on understanding what we have learned from forecasting. And then we have an array of things that we do know what to do, and we may not know everything, but we find out that we can discover more and more. And that's the best we can do. Well, let's do it and get about it quick. Which
is a lot. I mean, I would, if you'd tell me if I'm correct, but I do think your method of forecasting, I always think of you're constructing a topology of causality. That you're giving a list of all these possible places. It's the difference in the prediction, which has a sort of domino arc that you could somehow, you make some tap here and it just linearly moves to the future. Instead, what you say is, well, look, here's a space in which human activity really exists. Not the space of sense perception, not the visual space, but there's this whole other topology there of possible pathways. And I can now say I can use that as a way to define what actions are taken here now, to define the thing that will be defined as the future.
Well, we've always had, mankind has always had, as far as I know, some degree of insight into making decisions based on the future. But the other guy is saying, be practical. Conduct an experiment. And then assume it repeats itself.
Right.
And that's where the nonsense comes in.
Right. This is Hume. This is intentionally an imposed handicap.
Exactly.
All right, well, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.
In the future.
In the future.